for coming. When Tracy asked about doing this session, it was months and months ago. So the title, the original title that was created was, I think, Practical Mindfulness. This will still be related, but it's really going to focus more on specifically breathing. Most of the work I do with athletes related to mindfulness is around mindful breathing. I am the well-being coordinator at Lake Forest High School. Used to coach, no longer coach, but I work with a number of the sports teams at the school doing mindfulness work. I also, for the past 3 football seasons, have worked with Lake Forest College football, worked with Lake Forest College basketball. I've worked with professional kickboxers. I've worked with a number of athletes in a variety of domains. And it's really fun to take the stuff that I do within classrooms and schools and apply it to the sports arena. Because as a younger person, at one point I actually was able to play sports. I'd like to call myself an athlete still, but I don't know that I could get away with that. So we're going to look at mindful breathing. And when we think about performance, really in any domain, it just doesn't have to be athletics. There's 2 variables. There's your skill and your capacity. I'm sorry, the challenge and the skill or your capacity. And if you have too much challenge and not enough skill, you find yourself in a state of being overwhelmed and anxious. If you have too much skill and not enough challenge, you're bored. You become disengaged. This is the basic research of Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who created flow theory. You've heard of him. But he went around the world studying 500 world-class performers in every domain. Medicine, education, business, athletics. And he had them talk about what's called the phenomenology of high performance. What's it like for a high performer? What are they experiencing when they're performing at their best? So he started with just asking them to describe what they were experiencing. And he found that repeatedly they used the imagery of water to describe what it was like to be performing at this elevated state. And so as a result of that, he developed this, he distilled all of their accounts into kind of a framework, and he called it flow theory, playing off of this idea of water, the effortlessness of being in water, and how at times in water it feels like it's just moving you along. And so heart surgeons talking about heart surgery, that it's almost like they're not even there. They're just performing at this super high level, right? And so peak performance comes in any domain when we're able to develop our skills progressively over time and heighten the challenge. And the more we develop our skill, the more we develop the challenge, the higher our performance gets, the more rare our performance gets. Any of you have seen, I'm totally forgetting the name of it, Alex Honnold, the Free Solo is the name of the documentary, a rock climber. So he just climbed last year El Capitan, 3,000 vertical feet with no equipment. And he did this in less than 4 hours. Right? So I mean, nothing was attached to him. And so that's an example that I use talking about really developing your skill and trusting your skill and really pushing the challenge. And so what's inherent to this is stress. To be a performer is to learn how to dwell in a space of stress. And if you're going to develop as a performer, you have to develop your capacity to process stress. Because to persist in this place requires stress tolerance. And if you're an athlete, say you're in the NBA or MLB, NBA you're playing 82 games in a season, MLB you're playing 162. So you got to be there over and over again. So you also have to learn how to come down from being in that space so that you can return maybe the next day on the other side of the country, across multiple time zones. And so the skill work is really important. So the essential questions when we talk about performance are, how do we learn to maintain focus and perspective under stress? Because by nature, when we become stressed, when the stress response is initiated, it's about the immediacy of the moment and survival in the moment. And that impulse is probably the strongest impulse we have. It's kept our genes alive all the way back to simple organisms, so hundreds of billions of years. It's worked. And now we put ourselves deliberately into stressful contexts, likely because we don't experience them, acutely stressful contexts, like climbing El Capitan, because we don't experience these things on a daily basis anymore, acute stressors. Okay? And so once that stress response is initiated, how do we disengage from it, experience it, but maintain perspective and focus? Alex Honnold, when he's 2,000 vertical feet up, how does he maintain the fact of just focusing on the next hole, rather than being like, oh wow, I'm 2,000 feet off the ground, and if I decide I don't want to be up here anymore, there's nowhere to go. There's actually a documentary a different one, where he was climbing a more simple route in preparation for it, and he did have a panic attack in the middle of the climb. And so they film him, and there's a piece of rock that comes out, like a ridge, about this, and he just stops. He climbs away from the camera, the guy is hanging, and he just sits there, and he's standing, looking out over Yosemite Valley, calming himself down from a panic attack. It's about 1,500 feet off the ground. So even the best performers have these moments where they lose focus and they lose perspective because of the stress of the situation. And then ultimately, how do we learn to make better decisions under stress? And what's wonderful about sports is that it's a microcosm of life. It takes the stakes and the principles of life in it, and puts it into a heightened form where we can work these things out. Right? So these questions are just as relevant for everyday life as they are for any athletic competition. So in order to perform well, athletes must learn how to control the stress response, which means controlling the nervous system, which is not easy. And that's because our neural circuitry works like dominoes. Are you familiar with the HPA axis, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis? It's the biological mechanism that underlies the stress response. So when you get stressed out, you perceive something as stressful, your hypothalamus tells your pituitary gland to send a signal to your adrenals, and within seconds you have norepinephrine output, which is adrenaline, cortisol, and all these stress hormones. That's why your heart rate goes up, that's why your respiration goes up, that's why your blood pressure goes up, and glucose is quickly metabolized to your largest muscles so you can fight or flight. Right? And it happens instantaneously. Once this stress response is initiated and these dominoes are falling, it's very hard to stop that. Think about it. When you're in a stress tailspin, how easy is it to cognitively say to yourself, well, I just need to relax? Or how annoying is it when someone just tells you, you need to relax? Name a time that worked. Right? Or you were told that, or you told someone that and it actually worked. And that's because the part of our brain that we most need when we're stressed is the first to go. Prefrontal cortex. So once it gets going, there's really only two access points to stop those dominoes from falling. And so breath and vision are the only two autonomic functions of our body that we can exert conscious control over, which is fascinating. We are the only things on the planet that can consciously take a hold of breathing to change our internal state. Nothing else can do that. And we breathe 20 to 30,000 times a day. And the beauty of breathing is it's always immediate. When we talk about things with performance like nutrition, working out, all sorts of exercises, etc., there's always other conditions you have to deal with in order to achieve those things. You got to go grocery shopping. You got to have the money for the food. You got to have a dietary plan, whatever. Breathing, it's there. You're always already doing it, right? We're not going to talk so much about vision. The Huberman Lab at Stanford is working on all these ways to mediate the stress response through vision. It's fascinating. I can talk about it a little bit afterwards if you're interested. But for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to focus on the access point of breathing. So when we talk about mindful breathing, we're talking about three things. Understanding breathing in its relationship to your internal state. Breathing as a manifestation of your physiology, where your physiology is at, and breathing in relation to your mechanics. Are you breathing efficiently? Right? Are you causing undue stress by impeding your ability to breathe most effectively? So we'll start with state. The Krasnow Lab at Stanford 2 summers ago finally empirically verified what we've known forever, and that's that your emotions and your respiration are tied together. There's a shared pathway of neurons in the brain where they call it your emotional arousal level sends a signal, it's called the Botzinger complex, to your respiration. And so at every moment of every day, how you're breathing is a reflection of your internal state. It's unconscious, it's happening all the time. Right? And conversely, if you deliberately take a hold of your breathing and work backwards, you can change your state. So state dictates breathing, but we can consciously dictate breathing to control state. So it's a reciprocal process. Furthermore, the phrenic nerve connects the diaphragm to the brain. So the diaphragm is what makes you breathe. People often think that the lungs move on their own accord. The lungs have no ability to move whatsoever. They're completely inert. The diaphragm muscle that goes right through the center of your body is a reverse pump. And when it draws air in and your ribs expand out, it pulls air into your lungs and then your lungs expand. But your lungs can't expand on their own. They have no muscle. They're just tissue. And so the phrenic nerve runs from your diaphragm to your brain. What's interesting is phrenic is also in like schizophrenia, comes from the Greek, means mind. So when they named the phrenic nerve, they understood that the mind is deeply connected to our breathing, to the muscle that drives our breathing. And when we become stressed and we're able to breathe effectively by activating our diaphragm, it actually sends down-regulating signals to our brain to chill out, which is why so many people love exercising to deal with stress. What happens when you exercise? You regulate your breathing. Right? So you're basically telling your brain, we're dealing with this stressor. It's all good. Carbon dioxide also is the metabolic stress messenger of the body. Every moment you breathe in oxygen, about 20-21%, and then you breathe out, and you breathe out the waste product, which is carbon dioxide. It's the total metabolic waste product of being a live human being. And what we know, and we're going to talk about this more on the back end, CO2 intolerance, your body's intolerance to the buildup of carbon dioxide in your body is associated with panic, anxiety, and emotion dysregulation. To the point where there's numerous studies showing people with panic disorder and separation anxiety in particular, if you give them, I forgot the name of the mechanism, but you put it over their mouth and you have them inhale a slightly elevated percentage of carbon dioxide, they immediately go into a panic attack. We have these sensors all over our body called chemoreceptors that are constantly regulating the levels of carbon dioxide. And people with panic disorder, it's like a fire alarm that's super sensitive. So if you're on the other side of the room and you light a candle, it goes off. People with extreme sensitivity to carbon dioxide, it's a similar thing. Talk more about that later. State awareness. So when I work with athletes, this is like 101. On a scale of 1 to 10, where's my state at right now? Right. I use the analogy of the stress bucket. How full is your bucket right now? And if you're going into competition and your bucket's already at a 9 out of 10 because you don't have a self-care protocol, you're not recovering properly, then a little drop into the bucket is going to do what to the bucket? It's going to overflow. Raise your hand if you've had a rough day. You get home at the end of the day, and your dog looks at you the wrong way, and you're like, "Wah!" Right? Something very insignificant and small gets dropped in, and suddenly there's this overfill. And that's because we're not aware of where our state is at all day. And so with athletes and with students and with teachers or anyone, we tend to compartmentalize our lives, and we think we have different stress buckets for the different things we do throughout the day. Like I have my stress bucket for my job, I have my stress bucket for home, for my spouse, for exercising, and in reality you have one bucket and all these different stressors are hoses going into it. And if you're not paying attention to that, you're likely going to be finding that when I ask, where's my state right now, you're going to be too high. And you're likely not going to have skillful habits for downregulating. Right? If we think about our worst habits, they tend to be misguided attempts to manage stress. Right? So if we're constantly showing up high, typically we're engaging in maladaptive behaviors to manage that. So the first is where am I showing up? How do I know? What's my body telling me about my state? So if an athlete says, I'm at a 6 or a 7, how do you know? Because I just know I'm at a 6 or a 7. Well, you're making that inference based on information. What information? And they eventually realize the body, specifically breathing. Your breathing tells you, and the muscles that support your breathing, your chest, and everywhere, they get tense, and your breath gets tense. So your breath is so fascinating because if you use a car analogy, you have a dashboard, you have your RPMs, and if you're going 25 miles per hour down the street and your RPMs are redlining, you're going to be like, something's wrong with my engine, or I'm in the wrong gear. Right? And you'll shift the gear. Well, your breath is simultaneously the dashboard, the RPM monitor, and it's also the gear shifter. So it's getting athletes to be aware of where am I at, how does my breathing reflect that. Then becoming aware of how do I react to stress through my breathing. Is my response to stress a conscious skill or an unconscious reaction? 99% of us, it's unconscious. We just react. And we react based on the mechanisms that have kept us alive for a very long time. Right? And again, those don't care about the larger context of our lives or the life outcomes we're interested in, or if we're an athlete, the goals that we want to attain as an athlete with our performance. So it's learning to create conscious skills in response to stress. How does my breath reflect this? Do I consciously or unconsciously breathe while under stress? Right. So when you get stressed out, do you immediately go into freak out mode? Sometimes at the high school, I work with students who have panic attacks. 2 years ago, I had a student who had really bad panic attacks. She had a pass where she could get out of class and come find me, and we would just work on her breathing. Walk around the hall, and I would just ask her to find an exhalation. Because what happens when you start panicking, there's a lot of inhalations. It's very hard to find an exhalation. Just find me an exhalation. Find me an exhalation. Right? And now we have a skill. Consciously breathing. We're recovering that exhalation. We're bringing the brain back into balance, etc. So where do you go in terms of your respiration when you're stressed out? This is a wonderful question for athletes. Am I actually adapting or just learning to suffer better? For so many athletes, they just grind and they grind and they grind, and they're like, look, I'm doing better. It's like, no, you're not. You're compensating better. And in the moment, you frame your performance in the moment, sure, that's improvement by some arbitrary metric, how much weight you're squatting. But in 2 months, you're going to blow your back out because your biomechanics are completely trashed. They're gone, and a lot of things are compensating and taking that weight when they shouldn't be. And we do the same thing with the cardiovascular system, with running, lifting, whatever it is. So it's really important to understand, are we creating positive adaptations that might temporarily not get us the performance we want, but we're in it for the long run? Or do we just learn to suffer better and grind, right? Which just is not a sustainable strategy and really shortens the life of athletes. And when I'm working with athletes who are at a higher level, the thing about being an athlete is you have such a small window to maximize on that athletic ability. So you want to expand that window as much as you can and not shorten it. So a lot of that's about training properly. One way to do this, to practice breathing, is to simulate stress through temperature exposure. College athletes, training room, they have a cold tub. Put a bunch of ice in a tub, get in the tub. How do you breathe? Right? The cold is actually, it's a stressor, right? Your stress response really doesn't differentiate between emotional stress and temperature stress. It's the same mechanisms at work. So when you jump into a cold tub and you immediately go into a sympathetic mode, your nervous system's going crazy and your brain's going, oh my gosh, how do you breathe? Are you breathing through your mouth? Is it uncontrolled? So working with athletes of just, you don't have to jump immediately into a cold tub. You can tell them to start with cold showers. Right? Gradually build up. Get colder and colder. Pay attention to how your breathing responds to being cold. Can you regulate your breathing and breathe calmly in a cold shower? If you can, make it colder. If it gets so cold that the shower doesn't do it anymore, get in the cold tub. Right, and then once you're in the cold tub, and then you can breathe. Some athletes really start working on developing a skill. They can do 6 breath cycles per minute in an ice tub. So that's 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out, totally controlled. Then you just try to extend it even further. Right? How much can you prolong the breathing in the cold? You can do the same thing in a sauna. Sauna's a little different though, a little more complicated. If you have any questions along the way, stop me. Otherwise, I'm just barreling ahead. Physiology. What we call anxiety is often misunderstood and mismanaged physiology. This might be the most, if you forget everything from today, I think this might be the most important insight that I think current research is kind of unpacking. What we call anxiety is often misunderstood and mismanaged physiology. Because we're not self-aware, because we're not paying attention to what our body is telling us, and we're not using what our body is giving us, like our breath, our physiology gets dysregulated, and then we call it a psychological disorder. And I'm not saying psychological disorders don't exist. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying we too frequently assign that diagnostic category when it's really just, you don't understand how to manage your physiology in real time. What we call resiliency is skillfully managed physiology. So people who do learn breathing, do learn mindfulness, cognitive skills. We then can manage the system in real time. People say, oh, you're so resilient. Well, kind of. You're just a better manager of what you are. Your body. Right? It's like being a better driver behind the wheel of a car. You can just get into a car and just be half there and just kind of going around. Or you can get into a car and actually understand how the engine works, how it's communicating to you through the dashboard, how to shift the gears. CO2 and stress go hand in hand. Chemoreceptors and panic, we already talked about that. Building CO2 tolerance. So this is a little bit more complicated, but I'll do my best to explain it quickly because we could spend a half hour on this easily. One of the things that happens when the physiology gets amped up in a stressful situation, respiration kicks up. For people who are chronically stressed, it's often associated with what's called chronic hyperventilation syndrome, where we're over-breathing all the time. Because our level of emotional arousal is up, our respiration's constantly up. As a result, a lot of people start mouth breathing. Have you ever noticed that your athletes or students who are most anxious are mouth breathers? It's a textbook sign of anxiety. When you breathe through your mouth, you offload too much carbon dioxide. When you offload too much carbon dioxide, it doesn't have a chance to build up in your body enough. And so your sensitivity to CO2 goes down, which means any stressful situation triggers. Again, it's that alarm. So a quick assessment, we can do it. Take out your phone, go to a stopwatch on your phone. I do this with students all the time, like once a week. Do it with athletes, often before, if they're going to do an intense training session. So you go to the stopwatch, you close your mouth, breathe through your nose. And at some point here, just breathe through your nose for about 20 seconds. You don't have to time it, but just regulating your breathing so you get a more accurate reading when we do this in a second. Okay, at some point here on your own, in the next 15, 20 seconds, don't change your breathing at all. Continue to breathe naturally through your nose. After a normal exhalation, okay, pinch your nose, hold your breath, and hit start. And you're going to time how long it takes to get a distinct breathing reflex. This is not an absolute breath hold. Okay? So the first sign of air hunger could be a tightening in the throat, a sense of panic, just a general sense of like, I need to breathe. Could you hold your breath longer? Sure, you could. That's not the point. It's to measure the first distinct sign of air hunger. Okay?
After exhalation.
After the exhalation. Then you hold. You will know if you did it right with once you're done and you feel the air hunger, you stop and you take your breath in. Your recovery breath should be like the breath you took before you started. So you shouldn't be done and go, right? You held your breath too long. You've got, right? So it should be gentle. Your recovery breath, if we were mapping it out, it's like you're in, you're out, you're in, you're out, hold. Recovery breath, and now you're back to normal. Okay? So after an exhalation on your own, and exhaling through the nose. Don't change your breathing up to it. Don't bank everything on this first score. Okay? The best way to get an accurate score is to do this over time, specifically first thing in the morning, over the course of like 7 days. Then you can really start to get a feel for what it is, so don't go crazy based on the score. Raise your hand if you were under 10 seconds. Between 10 and 20 seconds. Between 20 and 30 seconds. Between 30 and 40 seconds. Over 40. What? Over 50. Dang. Your air reflex, your breathing reflex, is dictated by your CO2 level, not oxygen. So when you need to breathe, that is initiated by these chemoreceptors in your body telling your brain, breathe. When you're stressed out a lot, you get a distorted sense of needing to breathe, which makes you overbreathe. Okay? If you're under 10 seconds, it's considered high sympathetic tone, meaning there's a lot of stress being processed in your system, whether it's emotional or physical. Doesn't matter, right? So if you're an athlete, you might be the most emotionally chill guy out there, right? But you're just crushing 2-a-day workouts. Well, your bucket is still going to be pretty full, and you might get a really low score, even though you're psychologically calm. Okay? 10 to 20 seconds, very similar, high stress, high sympathetic tone. 20 to 30, better, right? 30 to 40, average, where the average person should be. Above 40, you're getting better. Really good score would be like 50, 60 seconds. Right? Where you can just sit there, breathe out, hold, and your system is just totally calm. Right? I have had probably 6 or 7 instances with young adults where their score is under 5 seconds. And I follow up, and I follow up for a reason, and in every single one of those cases, there's been significant trauma. And in 4 of those, they had no supports. And it was that breathing exercise that became the impetus of someone saying, hey, what's going on? Do you think maybe you did it wrong, or do you want to try it again? Let's do it again. And they did it again. I had one football player who did it, and it was 2 seconds. I mean, I could literally see his neck. Right? Now, do you feel panicked right away? Oh, yeah, it feels like I'm being suffocated. Do you have a lot going on in your life? And all of a sudden, it was, a story. And previously, before that moment, he was totally off the radar in terms of mental health supports, etc. So just that breathing exercise got him connected to where he needs to be connected. So how do you build CO2 tolerance? I'll do this with athletes. You can do, the assessment really is the practice. You can actually practice getting better at CO2 tolerance. One thing you can do is have your athletes just start exercising and doing a lot of their cardio through nasal breathing only. And that will actually start improving the balance between O2 and CO2. But the other thing that, like with basketball players and football players, will do walking CO2, so they breathe in, they breathe out, they hold. You don't actually have to hold your nose every time. So breathe out, and then you just count how many steps you can take before you feel that need for air hunger. And then as you start getting better at it, you feel the air hunger and you keep going. And you keep going and you keep going until you really start to feel panicked. And then you have that panic moment, and then you take your breath in and you try to stay under control. So you're simulating stress. You're telling your brain what's more stressful than that sense of lack of air, right? So then you have them do some recovery breathing. It's a very useful activity. So now, last part, third part, mechanics. Shut your mouth. I'm going to talk more about this in a second. Improve your posture so you can have access to your diaphragm. This is so important. You can't sit there all day as an athlete like this, in a collapsed position where your diaphragm can't fully expand and contract. When you crush this area of your body, your oxygen requirements don't go down. So if this muscle can't work efficiently, it has to work faster. So if you're sitting in a bad posture all the time and you're creating all these muscles and tissue that get bound up around your ribs and your thoracic spine, now you're just creating dysregulated breathing patterns because you have to breathe faster to get the same amount of oxygen in. And again, this is leading into that chronic hyperventilation. So posture is so important. There's a reason why in so many different martial art traditions, spiritual traditions, mindfulness traditions, it's always about ears over shoulders, shoulders over hips. It can be sitting, it can be standing, it can be lying on the ground. As long as you have that line here, this has access to move and open up. More efficient diaphragm means more efficient energy. And this is Haiku Deck, and I was changing some stuff before this, and I don't know if it saved it, if it's going to come later. don't think so. So even if you so the average person takes in about 7 or 8 liters of oxygen per minute. Okay. Say you do a lot of work like yoga, stretching, you work on your thoracic spine in particular, especially for male athletes. They tend to be, because of the way they lift, and just how males a lot of the time hold tension. There's a lot of tension in the thoracic spine. When the thoracic spine gets tight, the ribs get tight, breathing becomes less efficient. So let's just say you're an athlete and you breathe 7 liters of oxygen per minute. You start working on that tissue, you just increase mobility in your ribs a little bit, and now you're bringing in 8 liters of oxygen. That's a 12.5% increase of oxygen intake. That's free money on the table. You've done nothing other than get out of the way of your system and allow it to function more effectively, right? If you're into track, VO2 max, volume of oxygen you can bring in and out. So if you have a high VO2 max, you're going to be likely a good endurance athlete. My brother is a professional cyclist for Team Cliff Bar. And they have all these tests where they hook them up and they're constantly looking at their VO2 max. Just by changing your posture, your mechanics, again, the tissue around your thoracic spine and ribs, you can improve your VO2 max without changing anything else in the system. Yeah.
I was going to add on kind of that same thing. I teach a lot of yoga to men and athletes, and the pectoralis muscle, which pulls and is larger, can get really developed in men and boys, and so it also shrinks. That is same idea, right? Put whatever, if this is tight, that pulls that, and I noticed that muscle a lot. It's
hip
hard
flexors,
to open.
psoas muscle,
really
everything
a lot of
ties
curving
in.
because it's pulling.
Yeah. With male athletes, I'm generalizing here, I know, but they spend a lot more time on the sympathetic nervous system aspect of training, and they're not very receptive to or actively involved in the parasympathetic aspect of recovery, which should be an equal portion of training, right? And working with female athletes, they embrace it so much more. Like, oh, I get to rest, I get to relax, stretch, etc. So it's something when we're working with football players, I do this demonstration where I have someone come up and take a piece of wood and they go over their head and they do an overhead squat, and then they get down into the position and I have them try to blow up a balloon. Okay? And they're like, they have no capacity to do it. Get them on the ground. I have all these tools to use to work on the thoracic spine, hip flexors, psoas muscle. We do it for 2 or 3 minutes, get back in the same position, put the balloon in their mouth, balloon blows up. And then they're like, whoa. And they realize the amount of power that is lost because of inefficiency in your biomechanics and your breathing. So any athlete can benefit from it. Nasal breathing. This is so important. We are designed to breathe through our noses, basically all the time, except for eating, talking, and a tiger chasing you. Seriously. We are not designed to sleep with our mouths open. We are not designed to be sitting in a room at rest with our mouths open. It is, when your mouth opens up, you are signaling to your body, we are in DEFCON 1. Right? If you are at max capacity, max heart rate, which is called anaerobic, right? Because oxygen can no longer supply enough fuel for the muscle tissue that's moving. So you go into an anaerobic process. Right? When you breathe through your mouth, you are telling your body we're anaerobic. Why would you be anaerobic at rest? Why would you be anaerobic when you're walking across the room or up a flight of stairs or sleeping? Right? So, Brian McKenzie, who has taught me a lot of this stuff, I've done a lot of his programming and worked with he and some of his associates one-on-one with this stuff. He believes he works with top tier CrossFit athletes, professional athletes, Olympic athletes. He believes, based on his research with athletes, that you should be able to go 90-95% of max heart rate through the nose only. If you're a really conditioned athlete, that's how efficient you are. Right? For most people, they're going mouth breathing. You get on a treadmill and you put it up to, even an athlete who appears to be in good shape, put them on a treadmill, get them going at just a standard pace, and they're immediately that mouth is open. And they're just sucking air in. And the problem with doing that is when you breathe through your mouth, you're creating a lot of dead air in the lungs. It's not absorbed, it just hangs out there. So it's really inefficient. So nasal breathing facilitates inhalation of nitric oxide, a vasodilator and bronchodilator that increases oxygen transport throughout the body. So every time you breathe through your nose, your sinus cavity produces that, and it's signaling to everything to open up and receive the oxygen you're breathing in. This whole filtration system that's in your nose and sinuses, that's wonderful, designed by nature, is bypassed when you breathe through your mouth. It's going, like, all that's up here, you're just going down. Right? When you breathe through your nose, it facilitates and activates the diaphragm. I mean, you can feel that if you sit here and you go, and you breathe through your mouth, your diaphragm's always activated. But you get way more upper chest musculature driving the breathing when you breathe through your mouth. You also have panic receptors on the top nodes of your lungs. When you breathe through your mouth, you're engaging at a low level those panic receptors. It's part of that anaerobic metabolism. Facilitates greater pressure when you breathe through your nose in your whole system versus, right? There's a lot of slack in that system. That's where you get a lot of that dead air that comes in, leading to less dead air in the lungs and greater oxygen absorption. And when you breathe through your nose, you're not offloading a ton of carbon dioxide. You're offloading the appropriate amount of carbon dioxide. So that balance between oxygen intake and CO2 output is harmonized with your nose. When your mouth is open, it's gone. You're just dumping CO2. One of the things working with the professional kickboxer, we talk about it all the time with fighters, and in a lot of sports, but especially fighting, where if your opponent opens their mouth, step on the gas pedal. And all fighters know this. The moment someone starts breathing through their mouth, you've got that stress response crest. On the back end, you get the fatigue, exhaustion, and you fall apart. When that mouth opens with a fighter, they're dying. And if you're not there with them, with your mouth open too, that means you have fuel in the tank, step on the gas. So we would do all sorts of simulations with nasal breathing and pushing it so that where you're operating, where their 100% is your 70% or 80%. Right? So, I mean, that's a huge advantage in any competition. Where someone's starting to gas out, you're not even close to there yet. So, using breathing, you can use this to prepare for stress and performance. It's called superventilation. This is where, are any of you familiar with Wim Hof? No? He's a crazy guy who holds 20-some world records for exposure in cold situations. He swam underwater in ice water for 50 meters, ran a half marathon north of the Arctic Circle in shorts and bare feet. They put him in a tank of ice for like 2 hours and he never shivered. But he does all this through his breathing protocol, and it's called superventilation. There are types of superventilation in yoga. It's just where what Wim Hof does, you have to lie down because you'll faint. When I was working with the swim team at the high school, and we just got 7 swimmers going down to state today, which is awesome. I told them as we were doing superventilation when I introduced it to them, don't screw around with this, you can faint, so make sure you're lying down when you do it. And if you start feeling like you get ringing in your ears or you feel lightheaded, stop and just slow down. Well, this one kid thought he would just be funny, and he literally fainted. Thankfully, he was lying down on the ground. But What Wim Hof does is you're lying on the ground, or you can sit up if you're on the ground in an area that doesn't have a concrete floor, and you just go. You do that 20 times. At the end, after the exhale, you hold your breath for as long as you can. Okay? And you take a recovery breath in, hold for 10 seconds, go into another round. I did this over the summer for 2 months straight, just to get familiar with it so I could talk intelligently about it. I got up to a 3.5 minute breath hold. What it does is you're just mainlining oxygen in your body and then offloading a ton of CO2. And so then you can just, hold your breath for a very long time. And it's actually pretty euphoric, right? What's the advantage of doing this? It's heightening your sympathetic nervous system. So what they're finding is that when athletes do this before, he does this because he's about to go into cold water. So he does the breathing and he's getting his nervous system jacked up so that when he gets into the cold has less of an effect on him because he's already elevated. That makes sense, right? But when I do this with athletes before lifting sessions, etc., I can't tell you how many people have gotten PRs by doing this breathing, and then they go and they squat a PR or deadlift a PR because it's just up-regulating everything. Now, if you have high blood pressure, a heart disorder of any kind, anxiety, asthma, do not do this. Not safe. And there's also simpler ways of doing it too. I appreciate what Wim Hof has done. He breaks world records. Obviously, he knows what he's doing. But I think it's better to do the same thing, but through nasal breathing only. It keeps it more balanced, and it doesn't disrupt. That's very dysregulated breathing when you breathe through your mouth like that. So the application is very narrow. It's a very narrow context. But it's outside of that context, it's disrupting your breathing pattern as a whole. It's creating a bad breathing pattern in the long run. Right? And so that's one of the criticisms of it. So you can do superventilation before a contest. With football, I try to work with the particular coach because they had a ritual where they scream and they yell, they hit each other, they get all amped up, which is great, right? It's the whole idea. You're going out to play a violent sport, you want to get up. But you would see that they would get all amped up, they would go out onto the field, there would be the kickoff, and then there was a crash. And they went from 11 out of 10 to 2 out of 10 for the next 5 minutes. And I'm like, you gotta calibrate what they're doing. There has to be some method to the madness. So I was trying to work on him to have the team do superventilation together. There's other ways of upregulating the system so that when you get out there, you're not going to have a crash. Right? And it's a little bit more skilled and productive than just screaming and slapping and whatever. You can use it in competition to regulate performance. I'll talk about that in a second. And then after practice, it's a really great. How many practices just end and then people go? There should be a transition, especially if practice has been strenuous. You've had high sympathetic arousal for a whole practice. You need, as a coach, to lead them back down. So bring them into a place where you can do some recovery breathing, slow breathing down, bring the parasympathetic system back online. And that's more adaptive in the long run too. You'll get more benefit from your training rather than just kind of ending in a disorganized way and then moving on to the rest of the day. This was really beneficial for endurance athletes, basketball players. Really found this useful. It's called the breathing gears. So you can try this on a treadmill. You're running. You start at a pace where you can just breathe in through the nose, out through the nose comfortably. You get going a little faster. Now you have to power nasal in and then breathe out. At some point, you're going to have to it's gear 3, right? Power nasal in, power nasal out. That's right where you're at the anaerobic threshold, where you're about to reach a pace where oxygen can't supply it. Then you move to gear 4. You breathe in through the nose and out through the mouth, right? Because CO2 is building up, so you need to start offloading it. And then gear 5 is mouth in, mouth out. This is like a cross-country runner down the final stretch. You see all the lactic acid. That's one thing too. If you're breathing through your mouth, like as a runner, you're going to build a lot more lactic acid. You're going to increase that waste byproduct. Okay? So it's always funny. I used to coach cross country to watch the runners come down the final stretch, and you see the lactic acid building up in their body, and they're just like contorting and trying to run and everything, right? That would be an instance where you're breathing in through the mouth and you're breathing out through the mouth. But even if you're in gear 5, it still should be deliberate, right? You still should be controlling the breath coming in and the breath going out. It shouldn't just be, right? Do something to regulate the flow of the air. Even a little bit will help with the efficiency. You don't want to do this in training because it can blunt the adaptive value of training. You want to use it really only in competition. So you would practice it to get good enough to use it, but you don't want to use it in practice all the time, right? Because it'll lessen the extent to which the training has created an adaptive response. So control your breath, control the state. 5 minutes over. As a coach, there's a wonderful paradox in physics. Christian Huygens, who invented the pendulum clock 400 years ago, discovered that if you put pendulum clocks on the same wall, they all sync to the same cadence. I always use this analogy for teachers, coaches, parents. You are the master clock of your team, your classroom, your family. Your young adults will calibrate their emotional cadence pendulum to yours. And I can't tell you how many times I see coaches dysregulate their team by how they are. There's nothing more frustrating than coming in and working with a team, making progress, and then I'm done, and the coach comes up and opens his mouth, or usually his mouth, not often her mouth, for 10 seconds, and everything has just been by how they are. It's like, oh. So what's your practice as a coach? Are you self-aware? How do you respond to stress? One of the things, I grew up in the 90s. I was a basketball player. I know my height gives it away. In the heyday of the Bulls, Phil Jackson. I used to love Phil Jackson. They would be down by 20 points. The other team would be on a crazy run, and he wouldn't call timeout. He'd just sit there. He'd like, they need to figure it out. And they'd figure it out, and they'd win. Right? He had this way of just trusting my players. We've done what we can do. Now it's the game. It's on you guys. I'm just here to regulate, basically, not to call timeouts every 2 seconds and try to micromanage everything. How do you breathe when you get stressed out? You call timeout. Or you want to address something that's frustrating that a player keeps doing or the team keeps doing. Where's your breath at? Are you a regulating or dysregulating presence? I can't tell you how many coaches are a dysregulating presence. I used to have a AAU basketball coach who would come over and stand on our foot deliberately and then just bark. I mean, spit going onto your face. And you couldn't get away. Why? Because he's standing on your foot. Did that motivate me to play well? Did I feel when a team put on a nasty full court press? Was I calm? No, I was in this highly agitated mode. Remember, you coach with who and how you are. The how you are is so important. How you're comporting yourself. Mindful breathing is about bridging the gap between health and performance with the most powerful physiological tool we have, the ability to control our breathing. If you have questions, feel free to email me. On Instagram, I've just gotten on in the last year, and I'm going to start doing... I'm currently writing the Mindful Breathing Workbook for teens. It's coming out 2021. Keep an eye out for it with New Harbinger. When I'm done with that, I'm going to start doing a lot of videos on Instagram of just small lessons, exercises, etc., So if you're interested, in the next month or two, I'm going to start doing that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry I went over.